Can you expand a bit more on Hezbollah and what if you could give an ideological very overview of their stated goals, how real the constant connection, a lot of militia groups are defined as Iran-backed proxies in the Western press, and it sometimes it's hard to discern how strong those ties are. Hezbollah, pretty strong, but I mean, I guess if what the state of Hezbollah is right now and its origins and its charter.
I'll do my best because it's
Sure.
a great question and it's a dense question. I'll try to make it as simple as possible. It's many things at once. Yes, it is an Iranian proxy. It is a fully sponsored paramilitary force outside of Iran's borders. This is all accurate. It extends from Lebanon into Syria today, even into Iraq at times, and sometimes even into Yemen. That's true. But at the end of the day, it is also made up of Lebanese civilians that are taking part in this sub-state group's mission. Now that mission has evolved. Hezbollah in the 1980s, and its essence really is to push Israel out of Lebanon. For 2 decades or so, that was the cause, that was their cause, getting Israel out of Lebanon. Once Israel left the country in 2000, in May of 2000, the rationale for having that kind of infrastructure in Lebanon, it evolved. It evolved. We have a sliver of real estate between Lebanon and Israel. It's called the Sheba Farms. Maybe you've come across this in sort of political talks in this part of the world. It's a very small sliver of real estate. No Lebanese live there. It's technically Syrian. It's in the Golan Heights, bordering Lebanon, of course, under Israel occupation and annexation. That has become Hezbollah's geographic reason to stay armed. It doesn't sell well in this country. Post-2005 is really, I think, where the story becomes less about resisting Israel and more about, in my assessment, making sure there's no security threat from Lebanon towards what looks more and more like Iran's leverage in the region based in this country. And the reason I mentioned 2005 is because that is the beginning of a long string of political assassinations that have become the norm in this country. It is just 3 days ago that another politician was killed, but the list is so long and it's diverse. In 2005, it's a former prime minister. His name is Rafiq Hariri. It's his advisor as well, his economic advisor, Basil Flehan. But over time, you have diplomats, you have intelligentsia, journalists getting killed, and this happens increasingly. You have even people working for a UN body, Special Tribunal for Lebanon, that was meant to actually investigate political assassinations. Its verdict pointed at Hezbollah members. But 20 years of that kind of scenario, it's Hezbollah focusing their energy on politics in this country through security, meaning no tangible threat to what they've built here. And I'll give you maybe, I don't know if maybe I'm allowed to do this, I hope. It's a personal story for me. The guy in the background is my father. He's one of those politicians killed by Hezbollah as well in late 2013. It has impacted so many of us. All of us have lost friends to that long string of political assassinations. We've grown adjusted to it as well. And I think Hezbollah's primary concern right now is finding a narrative that sells because they're deeply unpopular in the country. Even when you have the conditions for their popularity, like the ongoing Hamas-Israel tragedy. They have the conditions for sympathy, but they're not being met. I think over time, Hezbollah lost their narrative and they lost their raison d'etre for Lebanese, yet it seems to not matter. And my understanding is that this is Iranian security first and foremost today. How can Iran and how can that regime best defend its interests outside of its borders and have less exposure to its interests within its borders? I think that's what Hezbollah represents right now. And that's tragic for Lebanon. And that's because it's a Lebanese group made up of Lebanese citizens. And it's harder maybe for the conditions for civil war to return right now. But people are speaking this language. And there's real fear on the streets of Beirut that the spillover to this long-term problem can turn into something very ugly. And it's a reminder of what Lebanon went through.
And it's a reminder of how Israel's continued belligerence and the knock-on effects of it have resulted, and the United States too. I mean, Iran and our coup there, right, has resulted in less democracy in the Middle East. Lebanon now with this Hezbollah kind of takeover and them acting as the de facto governing power, that has basically undercut democratic ambitions for people in the Middle East, country to country. And so, as you say, even though there is this broad sympathy as well towards the Palestinian cause, the autocrats are the people that are calling the shots in different countries, or whether it be militia groups. They're not responsive to that, and probably more susceptible, I would say, to money, to buying off, to operating in their own self-interests versus the democratic will of the people.
You know, I share the macro perspective, which is Arab-Israeli peace that excludes Palestinian suffering is silly. It doesn't add up. This attempt at trying to deflect by having peace across the region and ignoring Palestinian suffering and their lack of statehood seems to be a very foolish, short-sighted policy that took on some momentum in the Trump administration. I think that's a mistake. What is also a bigger mistake is the other side of American politics, which up until recently, and you're right, has been de facto kick the can down the road. Palestinian state doesn't seem to be on any administration's primary concern. This, I think, is a huge mistake. And the reason I share that micro assessment is clearly these problematic actors, whether it's Hezbollah or Hamas, whether it's Fatah in the 70s or any group that seeks to hijack this cause. It could be the Syrian regime, Saddam Hussein in 1990, 91, my exact years, I can't remember it right now, sent missiles into Tel Aviv to rally that cause and preserve his regime too. That kind of hijacking of a decent, genuine cause and perverting it over time, I think without a Palestinian state and without serious attempts at ending Israeli occupation and trying to end this nightmare once and for all, short of that, I think unfortunately the Middle East will remain the way it is. It is a primary concern for not just the bad regimes to fade away, but for citizens to have a normal life. And I share that wider lens.
Yes, and lastly, before we let you go, Ronnie, I'll return to kind of where I began, the present day of how many strikes and attacks there have been on southern Lebanon by Israel. What has the mood been in Lebanon? Are people fearful? You talked about how at night Beirut is kind of a bit of a ghost town, but how many people have died, and what this is the situation like on the ground right now?
The total number of deaths, if I'm not mistaken, on the Lebanese side is hovering around 350 to 400. I don't have the exact number. The number of Israeli deaths, I don't know. But in terms of the Lebanese side, whether it's Hezbollah militants or civilians, or even for that matter, journalists doing their job, somebody that I know was killed on October 13. A Reuters photojournalist was doing his job in southern Lebanon and was killed. These people are dying as well. But I think the bigger problem is that this country is so adjusted to abnormality that you can have this happening in the south. You can even have surgical strikes that hit Beirut. I think it's January. The top Hamas leader in the country was killed by an Israeli drone in Beirut, in southern Beirut. You can have that kind of strategic attack too, where a drone missile hits an apartment and hits the people in that apartment, and civilians upstairs and downstairs are spared. This is the kind of abnormality Lebanese grew accustomed to. And you can have a war zone in the south, in the southeast, in the east as well. And you can have also Lebanese going out. Now it's a holiday season. There's many religious holidays in this country that tend to line up sometimes all together. This year it's 2 variations of Easter and Ramadan. So Lebanese go out. There's traffic sometimes. People go out, they drink, they dance, they eat, they spend their night hours outside, knowing full well that there's a war happening, not just in Israel and Gaza, but in southern Lebanon. That's the country I've grown up in. I think that's the biggest tragedy, is that everyone's accustomed to it now, and the prospects for some form of positive stability long term, I don't see them emerging anytime soon.
Well, we can only hope. Ronnie, I really appreciate your time today. The podcast is called the Beirut Banyan. Walk Beirut. You do some walking tours. If ever anyone's ever in the area, you should hit up Ronnie and his group. Thanks so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
I appreciate it. I'd like to just say one thing, though, before we go.
Sure.
I know your platform, thanks to a friend of mine who's been on your show, Drew Mkhayel. He actually briefly introduced me to Michael Brooks. And Michael Brooks, this is a week before his passing. We were sort of interacting with each other online. I grew to find him very attractive, an insatiable laugh, serious politics and principles too, but also nuance, which is rare. So I've grown, I'm a big fan of the show. So thanks to Michael Brooks and your platform for letting me know better about what's happening in the US as well.
Thank you, Ronnie.
Thank you so much. That's great to hear. Really appreciate that, and have a good rest of your day. Or
Thank
night.
you. Oh, yeah.
Yeah.